Sandra, the numbers don't add up. They never have. I'm Joe, 31, and I've been in finance long enough to spot trouble. For the past 18 months, I've handled compliance reviews at Kelthorne Financial, the investment firm my wife Sandra's dad, Harold, built from scratch in Norfolk, Virginia. I started noticing small discrepancies in the books. At first, I brushed them off, but they kept piling up. Sandra's always been the golden child. Harold thinks she can do no wrong, especially since she joined the firm 3 years ago to manage client accounts. She's a natural, he'd say, grinning. Just like her old man. But I checked the client statements she prepared against the real portfolio balances. The math was off. A few $100 missing here, 1,000 there. Retirement accounts looked great on paper but were short in reality. When I brought it up, Sandra laughed. "You're overthinking it, Joe. Dad's system is ancient. Transfers take time." She'd kiss my cheek, but her eyes turned cold for a split second. Harold bragged about Sandra's quarterly reports. Her clients are beating the market by 12%, he'd tell everyone. But I knew those clients weren't seeing that money. Their accounts were losing cash while Sandra's spending skyrocketed. New clothes, fancy dinners, you name it. Last month, I started saving evidence, screenshots of mismatches, fake statements, transfers that never happened. I told myself I was paranoid. Then I saw Mildred Peterson's account. Her statement said $87,000, but the real balance was $62,000. Mildred's 74. That money's for her medical bills. The proof sits in my desk drawer like a ticking bomb. Every night, I kiss Sandra hello, watch her laugh at some TV show, and wonder if she's stealing from families who trusted her dad. Last month, she got a BMW, claiming it was a company bonus. Harold was so proud. Working late again. Sandra asked last night, leaning in the kitchen doorway, flashing a $2,400 diamond bracelet she called another bonus. I shut my laptop and stared at my wife, the woman I've loved for 6 years, married for 3. She might be ruining lives while her dad cheers her on. Something's going to break soon. I can feel it. I met Sandra at a cozy coffee shop just off campus while wrapping up my finance degree. She was stunning, bold, and had this knack for making big dreams feel within reach. Her dad had just launched Kelthorne Financial, and she'd talk passionately about helping Norfolk families grow their wealth. "Not like those cold, big city firms in Richmond," she'd say. "We're going to know our clients, their names, their kids, their hopes." Harold, her dad, wasn't sold on me at first. I grew up in a working-class family in Newport News. Dad fixed boats, Mom cleaned houses. But Sandra vouched for my number-crunching skills. After graduation, Harold brought me on for compliance and auditing. "Keep us honest, Joe," he said with a chuckle. "No room for slip-ups in this game." For 2 years, everything clicked. Sandra poured her heart into our clients, staying late to tweak portfolios or answering retirees' questions on weekends. Harold would glow with pride. "She gets it," he'd tell me. "This is about trust. People give you their future, and you treat it like gold." Things changed when Sandra became senior account manager. The late nights didn't stop, but the client calls did. She'd come home drained, saying she'd been reworking portfolios or digging into new investments. When I asked about specific clients, she'd dodge. "You know I can't talk about confidential client stuff, Joe." Then came the first warning sign. Margaret Williams, a widow and one of Harold's original clients, called about a mismatch in her account balance. Sandra brushed it off as a system glitch, but I checked the numbers myself. The money she mentioned? It wasn't there. I started watching her closely. Sandra's style got flashy, designer bags, pricey jewelry, spa trips. When I asked about the money, she'd wave it off as performance bonuses. Harold had a bonus system, sure, but her spending seemed way beyond that. The final straw hit when I overheard her on the phone with some guy named Derek, talking about moving the Richmond funds and keeping the trail clean. Later, she claimed Derek was a compliance consultant Harold hired. But when I mentioned Derek to Harold over lunch, he looked puzzled. "Derek who?" he said. Sandra never mentioned a consultant. That night, I started a file. Every sketchy transaction, every odd discrepancy, every half-truth. I told myself I was protecting Harold's business, safeguarding the families who trusted us with their savings. I had no idea how far Sandra's deception went. The moment everything crystallized was December 15th, exactly 9 days before Christmas Eve. I was reviewing year-end reports when I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Thomas and Ruth Bailey, both 81 years old, had trusted Kelthorne Financial with their entire life savings of $137,000. According to Sandra's statements, their account had grown to $153,000. But when I accessed the actual account, the balance showed $89,000, $64,000 missing from an elderly couple's retirement fund. I sat in my office until well past midnight, cross-referencing every account Sandra managed. The pattern was systematic, methodical. She'd been skimming money from retirees and covering it up with falsified statements. The victims were always older clients, people who rarely checked their accounts online and trusted the quarterly paper statements Sandra personally prepared. The total came to $218,000 stolen from 11 different families. I drove home in silence, my hands shaking on the steering wheel. When I walked into our house, Sandra was in the living room wrapping Christmas presents, humming softly to herself. She looked up and smiled, this warm, loving expression that used to make my heart skip. Now it made me sick. "You're home late," she said, tying a ribbon around a box. "I got your sister that scarf she wanted." I watched her finish wrapping the gift, watched her place it carefully under our tree next to all the other presents she'd bought with stolen money. The BMW in our driveway, the diamond bracelet on her wrist, the vacation to Mexico she'd planned for January, all of it paid for with money that belonged to people like Thomas and Ruth Bailey, who probably couldn't afford to heat their house this winter because of what Sandra had done. "How was work?" she asked, not looking up from her wrapping. "Fine," I said. But it wasn't fine. Nothing was fine. The woman I'd loved, the woman I'd married, the woman Harold trusted with his business and his legacy, was a thief. She was stealing from the most vulnerable people in our community while her father praised her performance and planned to leave her the company. I went upstairs and opened my laptop. For the next 3 hours, I compiled everything into a single devastating file. Screenshots of the real account balances, copies of the false statements Sandra had created, a detailed breakdown showing exactly how much money had been stolen from each family. I saved it all to a flash drive and labeled it simply, "The Truth About Sandra." I didn't sleep that night. I lay next to my wife, listening to her breathe, knowing that in 9 days, I'd have to decide whether to destroy her life or let her destroy the lives of 11 innocent families. The decision, it turned out, would be made for me. On December 22nd, I decided to give Sandra one last chance. Maybe there was an explanation I'd missed. Maybe the missing money was tied up in some investment strategy one didn't understand. I needed to believe my wife wasn't capable of what the evidence clearly showed. "Sandra," I said over breakfast, "I've been reviewing some of the client accounts, and I'm seeing some discrepancies." She paused with her coffee cup halfway to her lips. "What kind of discrepancies?" "Account balances that don't match the statements. Pretty significant differences." I kept my voice neutral, professional. "I think we should tell your father so we can figure out what's happening." The change in her expression was instant. The warmth vanished, replaced by something cold and calculating. "Joe, you need to be very careful about making accusations you can't prove." "I'm not making accusations. I'm identifying problems that need to be addressed." "Are you?" She set down her coffee and leaned back in her chair. "Because it sounds like you're questioning my work, my father's business, the business that pays for this house, your car, everything we have." I felt like I'd been slapped. "Sandra, I'm trying to protect the business. If there are problems with client accounts—" "There are no problems," she said sharply. "What there is a husband who's apparently been going through confidential client files without authorization. Do you know what Harold would think about that?" The threat was clear. She was going to make me the problem, make it look like I was the one acting inappropriately. "I have authorization to review those files. It's literally my job. Your job is compliance oversight, not investigating senior account managers." She stood up, smoothing her skirt. Maybe you should focus on your own responsibilities instead of trying to undermine mine." That afternoon, Harold called me into his office. Sandra was already there, sitting in the chair across from his desk with her hands folded and her eyes red, like she'd been crying. "Joe," Harold said, his voice heavy with disappointment, "Sandra tells me you've been making some concerning allegations about her client management." I looked at Sandra, who was staring at her hands. She'd gotten to him first, spun the story her way. "Harold, I've identified some serious discrepancies in client account balances that need immediate attention." "What kind of discrepancies?" "Statements that don't match actual account values. In some cases, significant amounts of money that appear to be missing." Harold's face darkened. "That's a very serious accusation, Joe. Are you absolutely certain about what you're saying?" "I have documentation." "Documentation you obtained by accessing confidential client files without proper authorization." Sandra interrupted. "Joe's been conducting some kind of unauthorized investigation into my work." "Is that true?" Harold asked. I felt the trap closing around me. I was reviewing accounts as part of my compliance responsibilities. "Sandra's accounts specifically," Harold said. "Why would you target your wife's work?" The question hung in the air. How could I explain that I'd started investigating because I'd noticed my wife's spending patterns didn't match her stated income? How could I tell Harold his daughter was a thief without sounding like a jealous husband trying to sabotage his wife's career? "I review all account managers' work," I said weakly. Harold sighed and rubbed his forehead. "Joe, I'm going to need you to take some time off through the holidays. We'll discuss this situation after New Year's when everyone's had a chance to cool down." "Harold, please, just look at the documentation I've compiled." "I don't want to see any documentation you've obtained through unauthorized access," he said firmly. "Sandra, I want you to conduct a full review of your client accounts. Make sure everything is properly documented and up to standard." Sandra nodded solemnly. "Of course, Dad. I'll have everything organized by the time Joe returns from his break." I walked out of that office knowing Sandra had won the first round. She'd positioned herself as the victim of an overzealous husband, and Harold had bought it completely. Worse, she now had advance warning and time to cover her tracks. That night, Sandra was surprisingly affectionate. She made my favorite dinner, opened a bottle of wine, and talked about how we could use my vacation time to reconnect as a couple. "Maybe this is a blessing in disguise," she said, curling up next to me on the couch. "We can spend Christmas Eve with my family and really enjoy the holidays." I nodded and smiled, but inside I was calculating. Sandra thought she'd neutralized the threat. Harold thought he'd solved a personnel problem. Neither of them knew I still had the flash drive hidden in my desk at home with copies of everything I'd discovered. They thought they'd won. They had no idea the game was just beginning. Christmas Eve morning, while Sandra was at the salon getting ready for her family celebration, I received a call that changed everything. It was Derek Morrison, the man I'd heard Sandra talking to on the phone weeks earlier. Except Derek wasn't a compliance consultant. He was a private investigator hired by Kelthorne Financial's insurance company to investigate irregularities in client accounts. "Mr. Williams," Derek said, "I understand you've been conducting your own investigation into account discrepancies at Kelthorne Financial." My heart pounded. "How did you know about that?" "Because your father-in-law hired me 3 months ago after receiving complaints from 2 clients about statement inconsistencies. I've been building a case, and I believe your wife is at the center of a significant embezzlement scheme." The room seemed to spin. "Harold hired you? But when I mentioned your name, he acted like he'd never heard of you." "He didn't want to alarm anyone, especially Sandra, until we had conclusive evidence. Unfortunately, your investigation last week spooked her. She's been working overtime to cover her tracks, transferring money between accounts, altering digital records." "Then you know about the missing funds." "I know about more than missing funds," Derek said grimly. "Sandra hasn't just been stealing client money. She's been running a sophisticated Ponzi scheme, using new client deposits to cover withdrawals from accounts she's already raided. The total amount missing is approaching $400,000. $400,000. My legs went weak. How many families? 18 client accounts compromised, most of them retirees who trusted Harold with their life savings. The full scope of Sandra's betrayal hit me like a physical blow. This wasn't just theft. She'd been systematically destroying the financial security of elderly people who'd worked their entire lives to build modest retirement funds. People like Margaret Williams, whose husband had been Harold's first client. People like Thomas and Ruth Bailey, who probably had no idea their money was gone. There's more, Derek continued. We have evidence Sandra's been collaborating with someone at Richmond Trust Bank to facilitate the transfers. This isn't just embezzlement. It's organized financial fraud spanning multiple institutions. What does Harold know? Everything. We briefed him yesterday morning. He's devastated, Joe. He built this business to help families, and his own daughter has been using it to destroy them. I sank into a chair. What happens now? We're coordinating with federal investigators. Sandra will be arrested within the next 48 hours. The charges will include wire fraud, money laundering, and elder abuse. She's looking at 15 to 20 years in federal prison. After Derek hung up, I sat in my empty house trying to process everything. The woman I'd married, the woman I'd loved, wasn't just a thief. She was a predator who'd been systematically targeting vulnerable elderly people while her father celebrated her success. Every bonus Harold had given her, every praise he'd heaped on her performance, had been based on her ability to steal from the clients they were supposed to protect. I thought about Christmas dinner that evening. Sandra's family would gather around their tree, celebrating another successful year for Kelthorne Financial. Harold would probably toast Sandra's performance, talk about how proud he was to have her take over the business. Her mother would gush about Sandra's success, her new car, her designer clothes. They had no idea their golden daughter had spent the last 2 years destroying everything Harold had built. I walked to my desk and pulled out the flash drive I'd prepared. All the evidence I'd compiled was there, but now it seemed insufficient compared to what Derek and the federal investigators had uncovered. Still, it was my evidence, my discovery, my chance to ensure Sandra's victims got justice. I had 6 hours until Christmas Eve dinner, 6 hours to decide what to do with the truth. The decision, as it turned out, was easy. I spent the afternoon making copies of everything, multiple flash drives, printed documents, detailed summaries of each compromised account. If Derek and the federal investigators already had their case, I wanted to make sure Harold and Sandra's family understood exactly what had been happening under their noses. At 4 p.m., Sandra returned from the salon, her hair perfectly styled and her mood cheerful. "You look nice," she said, kissing my cheek as I adjusted my tie. "Ready to go celebrate with my family?" "Ready," I said, slipping the flash drive into my jacket pocket. The drive to Harold's house was surreal. Sandra chatted about her cousin Ashley's new job, her mother's plans for New Year's Eve, her excitement about the bonus Harold was planning to announce at dinner. "He's been hinting about something special," she said, squeezing my hand. "I think he might be ready to make me a full partner." Harold and Patricia's house was decorated for Christmas like something from a magazine. White lights, elegant garland, a 12-foot tree in the living room loaded with ornaments and perfectly wrapped presents. Sandra's extended family was already there, her Uncle Vincent and Aunt Rebecca, her cousins Ashley and Tyler with their kids, her grandmother Eleanor in her favorite chair by the fireplace. "There's our star," Harold boomed when we walked in, wrapping Sandra in a bear hug. "Come here, sweetheart. I want to tell everyone about your incredible year." I watched Sandra beam under her father's praise, watched her accept congratulations from relatives who had no idea they were celebrating a criminal. Her cousin Ashley asked about the new BMW. Her Aunt Rebecca complimented Sandra's diamond bracelet. Her grandmother Eleanor talked about how proud Sandra's grandfather would have been to see her success. Dinner was torture. Harold raised his wine glass and delivered a speech about Sandra's unprecedented performance and her bright future leading Kelthorne Financial. He talked about the trust clients placed in their family, the responsibility they felt to protect people's life savings, the legacy he was proud to pass down to his daughter. Sandra cried happy tears. The family applauded. I wanted to vomit. After dinner, we gathered around the tree for the gift exchange. Sandra distributed presents she'd bought with stolen money to people who loved and trusted her. I watched Harold open an expensive watch she'd given him, watched him tear up as he thanked her for her thoughtfulness. Finally, Patricia suggested we open one present each before waiting until Christmas morning for the rest. The family laughed and picked through the pile, selecting gifts at random. That's when Sandra reached under the tree and pulled out the envelope I'd placed there earlier. "What's this one?" she asked, turning it over in her hands. It was addressed simply to the Peterson family. "I don't recognize the handwriting," Patricia said, examining the envelope. Harold shrugged. "Maybe someone dropped it off, and we didn't notice." Sandra tore open the envelope. Inside was a single piece of paper with a message I'd typed that afternoon: the truth about how Sandra spent your Christmas money. Below that, taped to the paper, was the flash drive. "What is this?" Sandra asked, but her voice had changed. The color was draining from her face. Harold took the paper and read it aloud. The room fell silent as the meaning sank in. "Joe," Sandra said quietly, "what is this?" I stood up slowly. "It's exactly what it says, Sandra. The truth." Harold plugged the flash drive into his laptop with trembling hands. The living room fell completely silent except for the Christmas music still playing softly in the background. Sandra sat frozen on the couch, her face pale as paper, while her family gathered behind Harold's chair to see the screen. "Dear God," Harold whispered as the files loaded. The evidence was devastating. Page after page of falsified statements, real account balances showing massive shortfalls, detailed documentation of every theft Sandra had committed over the past 2 years. "Thomas and Ruth Bailey," Harold read aloud, his voice breaking. "Statement balance: $153,000. Actual balance: $89,000. He looked up at Sandra, who hadn't moved or spoken. "Sandy, what is this?" Sandra's mother, Patricia, gasped. "Those are the Baileys from church. Ruth has cancer." The room erupted. Cousin Ashley demanded explanations. Uncle Vincent asked if this was some kind of joke. Grandmother Eleanor, reading over Harold's shoulder, made a sound like she'd been punched. "You stole from Margaret Williams," Eleanor said, her voice barely a whisper. "From the Petersons? These people buried their husbands and trusted us with their futures." Harold scrolled through more accounts, each revelation hitting the family like another blow. Sandra finally spoke, her voice small and desperate. "I can explain. I can fix this. The money's not gone. It's just temporarily." "Shut up," Harold said, the words coming out like broken glass. "Just shut up, Sandra." He closed the laptop and stood slowly. When he looked at his daughter, there was something dead in his eyes. 27 years I've built this business, 27 years of helping families, building trust, doing right by people who worked their whole lives for what little they had. His voice was getting louder. "And you've been stealing from them, from widows, from retirees, while I bragged about your success to everyone who'd listen." Sandra tried to speak, but Harold held up his hand. "Get out of my house," he said quietly. "Get out and don't come back." The Christmas music played on, but my hands trembled as I grabbed my purse. I glanced at my family, Mom in tears, my cousin staring like I was a stranger, Grandma's face twisted with disgust. At the door, I turned to Joe. "Please," I whispered. He shook his head. "The feds will be in touch." I left without another word. From the window, he watched me sit in my BMW, the one I bought with stolen money, my last selfish gift. I drove away, my heart heavy. 2 days after Christmas, they arrested me at my sister's house in Richmond. The charges hit hard: wire fraud, elder financial abuse, money laundering. My accomplice at Richmond Trust Bank went down the same day. The feds uncovered everything: $423,000 stolen from 18 families over 26 months. Dad shut down Kelthorne Financial for good. He couldn't stomach running a business I'd used to ruin lives. He drained his retirement savings to repay some of what I stole. The Baileys got 60% back. Margaret Williams got 73%. It wasn't enough to fix their lives, but it was something. Dad visited every family to apologize, carrying my shame like a weight in his chest. I pleaded guilty to avoid a trial and got 18 years in federal prison. At my sentencing, victims spoke of choosing between medicine and food, heat and rent. I kept my head down, unable to face the pain I'd caused. Joe divorced me while I was in county jail. I signed the papers without a fight. My family cut me off, and I don't blame them. I was the worst thing that ever happened to them. Joe moved to Charleston, taking a job at a small firm focused on protecting elders from fraud. It paid less, but every client he saved felt like redemption for not stopping me sooner. He still wonders if he could have acted earlier. But then he thinks of the Bailey's money returned, Margaret keeping her home. Exposing the truth became his only goal. I learned the hard way that love doesn't shield you from betrayal. But justice, when it arrives, can protect others from the ones you loved most.